Did you know that Louis XIV, the King of France, once said, "L'État, c'est moi. I am the state." This has gone on to become one of those prescient, signifying quotes of history, a moment where we can say, wow, that sums up his whole deal, huh? It becomes the parable introduction to 17th, 18th century absolutism, where students learn what Louis meant by that and the ways in which monarchs became empowered in the era, setting up to discuss the counterpoint, or rather dance partner of absolutism, the Enlightenment and the social contract. Today, I want to talk about the ways we communicate history. For the sake of exploration, I won't be tackling books I think most people have read. It's far easier to get my point across when people aren't going, "Yes, I love that book," or "That author has shaped my whole worldview since I was 14. And in that same vein, I don't want to pick on anyone for having favorites or for, in some cases, not knowing better. Further, I think if you're going to take a swipe at a work like Sapiens, for example, it should be either a quick anecdotal jab or a dedicated essay. I want to look into the layers of pop history. But to do so, we need a definition, and I'd rather keep this one simple. Pop history is historical media intended for non-academic consumption. That does not strictly mean it isn't educational, but rather that it's not the arena within which historians debate what happened. Pop history has other core intents that center on simplification, persuasion, or outright entertainment. Up front, one of the major indicators you're reading pop history is narrativization. This isn't a hard rule, but there are times when a compelling narrative belies a talent for writing, and times where it indicates a corner was cut with regards to rigor. In other words, sometimes things are too smooth or dramatic to be comfortably true. Before we construct some kind of structure for all this, I do want to stress that these traits are a bit mutable. There isn't actually a rigid shape or hierarchy of quality in a strict sense. One can, after all, write a treatise-length argument with the depth of a truism. Perhaps, for example, explaining the natural inclinations of a people, ethnicity, or nation. A few questions will haunt this discussion, but none bigger than, where do you draw the line on common knowledge, i.e., where does citation become necessary? This is especially important when a given pop history is motivated by or sells itself on shocking contrarian stories. This can range from mundane things like, did you know the Leaning Tower of Pisa was never upright? To speculations about the bedroom habits of historical figures, to trying to upend the whole of an established narrative. Lost cause type stuff. We should be comfortable with challenging our present understandings of history. That's like half the point I'm leading up to. But if someone claims the common narrative is wrong, they have to back up the argument. Conversely, when a pop history telling fully aligns with the general understanding of history, the absence of citations is far more excusable. But that leads us to the next question. Where is the line between a lie and a commonly accepted mistruth? And that brings us into the most basic form of pop history, simple truisms and misremembered, often false, quotations. There is an entire ocean of these out there, and the issue is that they oscillate between harmless and even borderline mnemonic in function to being foundational to someone's misaligned understanding of history. That might be a bold claim, but we'll get there when we get there. One layer up from that, or down, considering this is more of a descent into madness, is theories of everything. Now mind you, these can be localized, but they are often totalizing within their confines. These works are often the sort that explain the nature of a people, region, or humanity itself with the intent of being either predictive of the future or to justify an action of the past or contemporary action. They are often more structured than a simple truism. If a truism is a sentence explaining a whole swing of history, this is a paper, sometimes complete with citations and everything, which should lead us to scrutinize the citations. Point being, there is more effort being put into the theory and convincing you of it. Rather than seeking to explain an event and potentially its consequences or causes, they seek to explain the motions of history or a very unsubstantiated claim. Shock contrarianism is a staple element going forward because the next layer is what I'd call sensational revisionism, efforts to tell history like it's never been told, and this comes in two forms. The first is outsider history, which tends to be written by someone who isn't part of academia but is deeply curious and generally trying to adhere to the rules as they understand them. Without the mechanisms of professional peer review, however, they tend to let some odd sweeping bugbears or unsubstantiated beliefs sneak into their words. The second sensational revisionism is what I'll shorthand as bestseller history. History with flair and drama and subversion by way of, among other possibilities, a complicated relationship to sources. Books breaking into the New York Times bestseller list don't tend to correlate with being taken seriously by academics. Obviously, a book requiring a baseline graduate or even undergrad understanding of the subject isn't going to have mass appeal. Sure. But conversely, maybe the boring stuff is where the important historical work is happening. Now, that doesn't mean there's a one-to-one correlation between bestseller and bad history, but there is a tendency for journalist, novelist types to branch into history in, shall we say, irresponsible ways, holding on to old habits. Beyond the bestsellers, as I'm euphemistically grouping them, we enter into works that are pop, less in that they're not academically designed or not from someone with training, and more in that they're stooping to something. I'll have to leave that for a future dissection, unfortunately, but it's a complicated subject and deserves its own space. So with that said, we're going to be taking a trip from truisms and theories to borrowed authority and best-selling books. Okay, so this has haunted me for months on end, probably over a year now, but have you ever heard of the Battle of the Somme? Have you heard it referred to as the Great Fuck-Up? For context, the Somme was an extremely bloody day in the history of the First World War, whereupon some, mistakes were made, earning it the name, allegedly. You see, this is the tricky thing about the truism and quotes layer. It really is an absence of evidence situation. The fact I can't find a source for this quote doesn't disprove anything, but at the same time, nothing has been proven. It very well could be something the soldiers of the battle said and that it became common to use for a time, but by its very nature as a vulgar phrase with a negative sentiment towards leadership, there are historical disincentives toward it being put into the historical record. It was, in my examination, not at any point committed to writing, put into print, quoted in a newspaper within 5 years of the event. Tracking the history of the phrase is a challenge. I've seen secondary sources use it without substantiation. In The Great War and Modern Memory, originally published in 1975, the author, Paul Fussell, says, "The Somme affair, destined to be known among the troops as the Great Fuck-Up." And he has no citation. In this article on a site run by the Australian National University School of History, we have, "The attack was part of the Battle of the Somme, a military fiasco soldiers called the Great Fuck-Up." No citation. I looked through some archives to try and find newspapers that printed it and didn't find anything from 1916 on through 1926. By the way, you might be like, no, surely that's too vulgar. Papers back in such dignified times as insert decade of the past wouldn't print the word. I kind of cannot tell. A lot of search results came back for the word, but a lot of them were poorly transcribed to say the least. It wasn't perfect, and let's just say General Ferdinand Foch had a different last name half the time. Point being, I couldn't find anything in my search, and certainly not something as easy to find as your typical famous quote. And while part of that is potentially down to the fact I am not manually rifling through a half-decade of newspapers, I'm not the one putting the quote in a book. And yes, this is trivial to litigate in some sense. Who cares, really, if people never actually said it? It doesn't actually capture the public imagination in a deep, dramatic way or have an impact on our view of history, and besides, the Somme was a disaster, so real or not, it does sum up the event. But then, doesn't the truth count for something? And what if it did have a big impact? What if it was something like "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, by Louis XIV? Would it matter if that phrase wasn't real? Because, well, it is in fact unsubstantiated. Despite being quoted all over the place, being the hook of every history lesson about absolutism, despite being in such rigorous and sourced works as video games and YouTube videos,
I am the state.
It's not real. I know it's Wikipedia, but I went and looked at the sources, and the quote is indeed shown in print in the 1800s and contested in print in the 1800s. Despite the contestation, it's still pervasive. It's a Civ classic, you know? Further, it's that same situation from before of having to prove something that isn't substantiated did not happen. Evidence it was said is non-existent, but belief is high. Enough so that I'm compelled to have counter-evidence, which looks like what exactly? It isn't a misremembered quote or a phrase that derives from a documented source that was corrupted, like, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him well," where we have an original, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio," to compare to. Nor can I disprove it in the way one could a made-up Shakespeare quote by, reading Shakespeare's work and noting it comes up nowhere. There is, however, another quote, far less famous, one with a few shared words, but in one reading a near antithetical sentiment. Je m'en vais, mais l'état demeurera toujours. I die, but the state remains. What's fascinating here is that in plain English, this is near the opposite. Louis is decidedly not the beginning and end of the state. The state endures him, outlives him. And on another level, it actually stands as an entry into an entirely different, though less contrary, historical lesson, where "I am the state" would be the intro quote for absolutism. "I die, but the state remains" is a compelling encapsulation of the supremacy of the state itself. It highlights the transition from the Bourbon Kingdom of France, from understanding countries by their rulers and sub-rulers, to understanding them by their cohesive government, as France. It contrasts the importance of Louis with the unimportance of Louis. Note, however, it isn't a perfect little lesson, even if it is a more true quote and there's something equally mnemonic to it. Part of that is down to the fact that absolutism is a somewhat easier lesson than the definition of a state, which is contested. Back to the main actual point. Honestly, once you open up to such a famous quote as "I am the state" being false, you realize that a lot of the poignant quotes, need a citation. See also "Let Them Eat Cake," which people are coming around on, I think. And look, I'm not telling you this to bring you down, nor to turn you into a contrarian annoyance at house parties. If you're watching this video, you may not need my help with that. I'm telling you to get you into thinking about how we accept things as fact. And if you're feeling a sense of resistance to letting go of truism, there's something worth exploring in that. History, like any science, has many places we must be eternally skeptical and open to new information, and few places where we can be forever comfortable. But that doesn't mean it's all a sham or that we need to start citing things like this. And it brings us nicely to our next category, which at its foundation is about taking presumptions and turning them into a worldview. Longtime viewers of the channel, the passage of time, people who've seen my other work might know I've come for Glubb before, and it was in a semi-dedicated fashion, comparing his work on the way empires fall to how Civilization the game series models falls. Is it lazy for me to go after him again? Maybe. But his work and the work it represents is important to dissecting how pop history works. Or rather, it's a good case study and I have an axe to grind. Maybe you don't know Glubb, but you know this meme. Let me explain where this meme is sourced. John Glubb was a British colonial officer lamenting the decline of his own empire and trying to rationalize why it was happening. In doing so, he made this chart, which is famous among history nerds for the absurd implications it creates. Now, defense of this chart, where there is any, lies in arguing that he's talking about, per his wording, rise and falls, not durations of empire, that he was charting the concept of peaks. These terms are never defined. If we assume them to mean just the peak, that doesn't really line up, now does it? Let's take some brief examples and just poke at them. A very common element of these big theory truisms is some sort of eternal constancy of nations. This chart partially bucks that trend, but in a manner so inconsistent, it's almost worse. Spain is just Spain, where Russia, in order to fit, is Romanov Russia. Now, Romanov Russia doesn't just slip gently away from its peak. The date given is the definitive end of Romanov Russia, unless we're counting the post-decline period as a matter of months. Rome being split between Republic and Empire is interesting for the same reason. Clearly this isn't charting a height, it's charting the end when it comes to the Republic. And the Empire doesn't start on this chart some ways down in the midst of territorial expansion as with the Ottomans, but right at the moment the Empire starts. Britain is curious because it's one of the exacting 250 years ones, and its start and end dates are wrong by any and all accounts. Britain was formed by the Act of Union in 1707 if you want to pick a very concrete date. It also did not collapse in 1950 as the author, a British man who lived until 1986 and published this work in 1978, no doubt knows. Or knew, he's dead. The empire was certainly in decline around that date, with Indian independence in 1947, but to mark a fall at precisely 1950 is odd. Why be exact with the formula when it comes to Britain when the Arab Empire is an arbitrary 246 years, Greece 231? And hey, on that note, are we really going to go with Alexander and his successors for arguing a Greek empire in its greatness lasting 231 years? The Greek Empire endured past the conquest of Greece itself? There's no way to read this chart as based on anything but vibes and presumptions. 250 years is a joke concept trying to explain both too much of human history and applied to, oddly, not enough of it. There's a stark omission of empires from outside the old world of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. But all this begs the question, was this meant to be pop history? No, Glubb wasn't trying to write a bestseller, but he was smoothing over the narrative. No, he didn't make the memes that managed to permeate right-wing and leftist circles online, but they're there. 250 years is a pop idea. I wince every time I see it. He blames women getting jobs for the decline of the Abbasids because he's not actually ever talking about history. He's projecting his present fears into the past to make some kind of waves of history theory to rationalize his fear. And it has had an impact. It has shaped how some people view history. The fate of empires may not be pop history per se, but the truism it spawned, 250-year empires, is. Let's now take the opportunity to jump into something a bit more substantiated, to prove that substance doesn't preclude one from bold claims. So, Scotland is basically one big historical truism, to be honest. No, that's unfair. What I mean to say is that there's a lot of accepted fact and contrarian counterpoint accepted fact that mingle in the discussion of Scottish identity, and it's fascinating to watch the litigation of a national identity that now exists in the broader contexts of asserting distinction from the English and selling ancestry to Scots themselves and to Americans. That may sound like one hell of a tangent, and believe me, I'm sparing you like 10 paragraphs here, but here's the necessary brief. The historical romantic image of Scotland is often incidentally centered on the nature of the Highlands, both in the sense of literal natural spaces and in the idea of an idyllic place that houses a true culture. The contemporary romantic image is a little different. If I had to pick a tweet that really sells it, it'd be this. Now, contemporary Scottish politics heavily involves the question of independence from the United Kingdom, from Britain, from the English. In turn, the question of what makes Scotland distinct from England has a renewed enthusiasm and scrutiny, and the answers often fall, once again, to elements of a Gallic Highland, to things like tartans, once symbols of a Gallic culture the Lowland Scots wanted to distance from, now a symbol of a true Scot, wholly unlike the English. And if you're thinking citation needed on that last part, that's good. Nurture skepticism. In this case, I'm presenting a newer prevailing view. Here's one of many books on the subject, From Tartan to Tartanry, Scottish Culture, History, and Myth by Ian Brown. That isn't the book we're discussing, by the way. The next book, which is about Scottish land ownership, is The Poor Had No Lawyers by Forester writer-politician Andy Wightman. The book starts off with an introduction condemning academic institutions for being opaque and not accessible with sources and journals and stuff, which is so satisfying to read in print. This is genuinely worth calling out. But it sets us up for something as well, the writer's source limitations, qualifications, and voice. Andy is also a popular blogger in the Scottish political sphere. Now, it would be cartoonishly unfair of me to swipe at those things from the platform that is youtube.com. I've had times myself where an ideal source was paywalled and just had to find something else. Like, sorry, but I can't pay $40 to get a PDF, and that's a dent in my own credibility for sure. I'm making an unfortunate compromise that some people have the resources to overcome. This isn't a woe on me, it's to say that I understand. And more importantly, it establishes Wightman's outsider position and his awareness of it. If you look up Wightman's work on JSTOR, you will find no reviews. Indeed, it is hard to find academic reviews of his work on the internet as a whole. I found one, but it was paywalled. Look, I told you Andy had a point about academic accessibility. The abstract was less than flattering, but the whole review, which I did get into, is a bit more tempered. It led me to another review, and between the two, there's something I do firmly agree on. It is a good book, but not an academic work in the strictest sense. To quote the review by George Gretton, a legal scholar, Mr. Wightman's book, for all its merits, is not in the style of a PhD. It is a tract for the times, seeking not only to inform, but also to persuade. I was sometimes left with the dissatisfied feeling that one has after hearing a speech by an able politician. The Poor Had No Lawyers is, in every sense, the work of an outsider to the profession. It does not claim to be history per se, but that is in fact what it's attempting to be. My copy, a 5th printing, the 2015 edition, misspells the word democracy on the first page. Is that considered poisoning the well for me to mention it? On the one hand, I've misspelled stuff on a first frame before, probably. Detractions like this aren't sufficient to condemn a work, but on the other hand, when you've got a publisher and editor and it's been printed several times and has that magical authority of being in print, an error like that sticks out. Before we get into the book itself, I want to step aside to clarify the credentials of Andy Wightman. He has a degree in forestry attained at the University of Aberdeen in 1985. He is not a trained historian and notes this himself. In the acknowledgement section of the book, he says he was inspired to dig into this topic of land ownership ostensibly by spite. His forestry peers did not, he claims, think much of the questions of land ownership law and how it might intersect their interests. This cross-disciplinary approach is commendable, and I would even dare say valuable. His understanding of legal matters and land rights does give him a position from which he can approach the history of land ownership. He is also, however, a politician, an elected official and former member of the Scottish Green Party, which is, of course, going to reflect in his book. While there aren't any JSTOR reviews of his book, more casual readers occasionally note it has the makings of a manifesto, and I do agree in that he does tangent off into very clear politics in the middle of discussing, say, the acquisition of church land in the Reformation. The book is a run through the history of land and property ownership in Scotland, written to be approachable and informative and to give a sense the author knows his stuff. But I had a moment where I hit a too good to be true snag. And once you hit those, you can question everything. So the snag in question, Robert the Bruce. The way the book discusses Robert the Bruce brings in some baggage from the present. So it is that Robert the Bruce, national hero and Scot among Scots, was actually a conniving swindler opportunist and responsible for 500 years of unforgiving property law and really more Norman than anything else if you think about it, and okay, what is going on with this? The point ultimately being made here is that land and ownership was always a losing game for the poor more than it was an ethnic or national struggle. Hundreds of years before the Act of Union, even after Bannockburn secured independence, the poor still suffered, even without the English. I don't disagree. The issue is that in order to make a point about the nature of Robert the Bruce, there's this unsubstantiated assertion that he wasn't from here all the same. The book sets up the situation and acknowledges pitfalls like the Scottish Commons versus Highland clearances and the rich versus poor and all, and undermines itself with this moment in order to imply that Norman custom was what made the poor of Scotland suffer. Again, to be clear, the book in most cases doesn't default to the cheap free narrative that we were colonized too, or everything bad was the English. An entire section is about the theft of land during the Reformation from Scots by Scots. But it does it here in a deeply frustrating way. In one sentence, we have, to argue that Bruce secured Scotland's independence is to suggest that there was a polity called Scotland in 1314. The idea being that it is anachronistic to call Scotland a nation in the time of kings, that Robert I did not have a romantic notion of Scotland, he had a pragmatic notion of Scotland as a kingdom that would be his. In the same paragraph, we have, "The prize was the Scottish crown, and the principal exercise of that power was in granting rights and privileges to Bruce's colonial friends, who, after Bannockburn, became the beneficiaries of an exercise much like that carried out by the European powers during the Berlin Conference." Which is deeply anachronistic and falls right into that tired pit of "we were colonized too." Wightman, with painful frequency, in my view, correctly notes the underlying common thread of Scotland's land ownership conflict is class, only to undercut himself with consistent comparisons to colonialism alongside a tepid disavowal of the idea that Scotland was actually colonized in that way. Charitably, the common mechanism between Bruce and Berlin is the partitioning itself, the laying down of new boundaries and declared ownership to be enforced later. But such a comparison is only accurate in the highest abstract of land being divided. In practice, Bruce and his, quote, colonial friends were already in Scotland. Bruce was already king. There was no singular formal mapping session. What comparison is there to make to the Berlin Conference? Once you have that moment in reading a book, once you have a grand claim made and it challenges your perception, it can be exciting and fascinating. And then it transforms when you note that there's not really a substantiation, and that can sour trust. Once the trust between reader and author is questioned, the book can no longer flow. You want for credibility more than narrative. Perhaps the idea that Robert was a Norman actually felt like common knowledge to the writer. In fact, I'm sure one could find sources that also make this claim, but the consensus is that he spoke local languages. Hell, he probably spoke Gaelic, which, if that's any measure of a true Scotsman, then on that count alone, he's more true than most of the lowlands as a whole. It is, of course, not a true measure of one's Scottishness, but the contrary claim was that he was part of an immigrant Norman class and distinct from the people he ruled. But why make that claim? Of course he was distinct. He was a king. What does perceived foreignness do here? While the idea that feudalism itself came from elsewhere is relevant, the mixed emphasis on Normans leaves me wondering if the point is, as he states in one section, that parallels are not worth drawing, or if he's doing exactly that. And what value is there to sidestepping a parallel to the English of today if it still calls on a parallel to British imperialism in Africa? Hold that thought for a moment. There are other sections here and there with questionable sourcing, less than that the claims are significant and unsourced, and more that we find the line of common knowledge. For example, quote, "At a court held on Iona on the 24th of August 1609, 9 of the chiefs signed the document," said document being the Statutes of Iona. The section goes on to list specific conditions of the document in paraphrase, that vagabonds be expelled, liquor be controlled, and so on, and concludes the paragraph on the quote, "and bards, the bearers of the culture, would be, quote, apprehended, put in the stocks, and expelled from the islands." Now the question is, then, if this document and its contents are common knowledge enough for merely naming it to equate to sourcing. Interestingly, yes, to an extent. In an essay titled The Statutes of Iona in Context, Julian Goddard describes them as common to textbooks, and that would arguably pass the test of common knowledge. But this essay is about how they've been misunderstood for over a century. It's an interesting read and a sign that understandings of history change, and it also came out in 1998, so it's possibly a reflection of Wightman's outsider status that he cites the old understandings of them, and through that the new understanding is not common knowledge. Relatedly, per the review I first mentioned by one Malcolm Combe, scholars of most disciplines will cringe at a precarious reference to Wikimedia Commons in Chapter 22. Beyond that, there's a tendency to set the scene of some chapters with the history of other times and places that might, tangentially, if you squint, have a parallel or two. This is, I find, to give an air of having researched more, of being learned, knowing history. For example, there is a chapter that wants to make the ultimate point that a small island in the North Atlantic was seized by Britain in the 1970s using a model that it ultimately always had. That of a declaration from the sovereign that the land was British now. In turn, it's fair to bring up the legacy of colonialism, but it takes 4 pages, starting with the claim that things haven't changed since Robert the Bruce in 500 years, to end up on the point, quote, "The annexation of Rockall involved exactly the same sort of procedures as were involved in the colonization of much of the British Empire, with the single exception that there were no native people to deal with in the North Atlantic." And point aside over how large a single exception that is, what is the comparison in service of? It might enlighten the reader to the colonial process, the legal nature by which so much land was seized, the way conquest is legitimated to an extent, but that, plainly, isn't the point. The comparison itself only is cohesive to the start of the chapter, to mentioning Robert the Bruce via the common thread that land was seized in the name of a monarch. It constructs a degree of grand narrative where there plainly isn't one. That's the microcosm of this book. Interesting lessons, sometimes on topic, sometimes with clear expertise, and other times with a veneer of history in order to narrativize. You will find a lot of not unlike insert colonial moment in this book. Quote, "Just as in 1889 when Queen Victoria granted a charter to Cecil Rhodes, so the monarchs of Scotland drafted and granted feudal charters to the nobility in Scotland." It's not making the cheap and frankly tactless argument that England did exactly to Scotland what Britain did to its colonies, but it is making a comparison so broad as to be either arguing powerful people have always been like this, or exists to pad out the book with loose familiarities appearing to buttress an argument. More so than making the history palatable, it makes the history convenient. The review which called him a politician is quite right. Andy Wightman is a politician, and has made a rhetorical argument with this book, using history. While historians have biases and points of their own, they argue those points through lenses and sources, where, with this book, Andy wants history to have made the point he wants to see made. The latter portion is contemporary, with plans and suggestions and ideas for reform. In that light, it does not position itself, as I said earlier, as a history book. But it uses history in such a way that I can't ignore what it's doing. It uses history in such a way that people will read it and think they've learned lessons they haven't amid the things they did. Which, honestly, might be better than where we're going. I'm not a big fan of using the New York Times bestseller list as some kind of metric for quality of writing, nor quality of argument. By their own admission, the system can be gamed a bit. And of course, not every bestseller list is the same. The ecosystem of best-selling, however, is important because it has enabled a trend of non-historians writing history books. And on some level, I can't say I mind, certainly not when someone has a social science background. But it does matter when they get further away from the social sciences and when they start getting towards having a questionable intent to writing history. One man in particular has managed to straddle the line between academic historian and bestseller for a reason. Enough so that he was presented in a Stalinism historiography class I took, and I'm still not sure if the point was to get us to tear him to shreds or if it was a sincere pick. Simon Sebag Montefiore. Specifically, I want to look at his books Stalin, Court of the Red Tsar, and, more limitedly, Young Stalin. The two books are companion works and their approaches are very similar, though they do differ in some important ways. My copy of Red Tsar was printed in 2020, and the first 7 pages of the book are blurb review quotes. This is subjective and petty, but do you ever get the sense someone is trying to sell you on something a bit too hard? One of the quotes is from Henry Kissinger. Robert Service, one of the historians within the 7 pages, describes the book as based on extraordinary primary research and grants that the idea of using correspondences is clever. This is a sentiment I've seen shared by other historians, but we'll get to that soon enough. Now there's a conversation to be had around the intent of a book like this. Again, it is educational, but not academic. But Robert Service finds it valuable to academics like him. But then it's also entertaining drama. But if the Scottish football manager Sir Alex Ferguson came away from Court of the Red Tsar with a blurb saying, how he managed to kill probably 30 or 40 million people and conceal it is unbelievable, well, it feels important to address the book for its claims. For one, where did that come from? Is it in the book, or is this book, which is more about the deeply personal, human, monstrous side of the Politburo, the people in it, changing the context around a history Alex already knew? There is no one part of the book I could find that neatly confines the death toll of Stalin to 30 to 40 million in one thought. There are places here and there where the dead are counted, the gulags are noted, where the famine is mentioned. But history isn't the point, and the facts aren't forward. One thing you'll notice reading this book is the lack of citation on anything, at least in the physical copies. The only footnotes are asides, asterisks rather than citations. There are a heap of sources in the back of the book, but it's near impossible for a layperson to grasp where he's sourcing things from amid the pile. The digital version has citations, but they are imperfectly applied. Further, Montefiore is the type of writer to write as though he's there, in the moment. He constructs a scene, and he does not buttress it. There is often an explanation of Stalin's emotional state without eyewitness accounts to draw directly from. You'll see things like this and wonder, was this an actual conversation? Where did this come from? The proliferation of dialogue tags is probably engrossing for some people, but for me it just makes me wonder where he's getting things. His first chapter after the dramatic prologue takes 8 pages to hit its first citation. The sentence it is attached to simply says, "This explains much that happens later." The book does direct you to his website, where the sources can be found in a PDF, but it's not like the paperback copies have endnote numbers, so the cross-reference is difficult. You don't know where the citation would even be pointing now that you have it. When you do inspect the endnote, it looks like this. Within this mass, there are archives, entire books, and select segments, all crammed together. Why is this a thing? This is, frankly, not an accessible way to do history for a book that is supposedly so approachable. I understand that pop history books are lighter on citation or don't feel the same pressure to be thorough or directly present their notes, but if, as Service suggests, Montefiore's work has value to academics and that value is his sources, surely he should be held to that standard, yes? And you might ask, what good is it to let a rando reader know what impossible to reach Georgian archive he pulled this from? That's a good point were the book Pop History alone, but again, this one wavers in and out of that distinction, and while that's not necessarily on the author or the publisher, I've seen it cited in papers, and if it's seeing academic use and selling itself on the endorsement of academics and its invaluable sources, it should have the academic standard. I frankly cannot think of a valid reason to exclude citations from a book like this in the physical format. Does having a little number at the end of a claim diminish the flow? Earnestly? Even with a cited version, the citations are sparse for the amount of anecdotes and personal stories used. This is a staple of pop history, a deeply, deeply frustrating one. His descriptions of people bleed from generally weird and rude ways to describe someone into claims that demand but find no substantiation in his work. When describing Vladimir Dekanizov, one of Lavrenti Beria's underlings, he goes with, "This red-haired midget with a taste for English movies and teenage girls." And like, I get Beria and his gang, as they're sometimes called, are not favorably remembered by history, and did some heinous things, but maybe the first time you mention someone, if you describe them as having a taste for teen girls, you should put a citation? Also, according to other historians, including one who knew Dekanizov personally, he had blonde hair, so I don't know what's going on there. And further, this is not somehow the only time he describes someone as having red hair and a dwarfish or midget stature. Alexander Poskribyshev also gets this treatment, quote, "small, bald, reddish hair, twitchy-faced, and later in the section, Quasimodo." Montefiore is quick to quote when Stalin bullied people and how, as with the aforementioned Poskribyshev, but calling him all those things I listed, those were Montefiore's own words. It's unprofessional and off-putting. Far more than being appropriately or vividly descriptive, it feels like a proxy for wit. Simon also has a tendency, if you couldn't tell from the title, to write these dramatic juxtaposition ideas like Red Tsar. It's shock contrarianism. It is at its core a book designed to take preconceived notions and reify them with tangential anecdotes, speculative pathologization, and Sovietological style extrapolations from personal interactions. It demystifies Stalin by making him human, but also terribly simple. It is great man theory for the modern age. Academic review of his work is scarce. Now, I don't know why that is for certain, I can't, but it's possible that it's anything from academic condescension to a sense he isn't writing that kind of thing, being a fully academic work or something in between. The issue is that the book has its blurbs. It has a largely positive reputation resting on the prose and archival work. But within the few reviews I do find of his work, there's this recurring notion that he's a talented writer and a journalist at heart, finding sources, but maybe being indulgent when it comes to drama and narrativization. And that's not just something I think academics should shrug off. One review I did find from Golfo Alexopoulos articulates some of the frustrations I also had. In noting a habit of Montefiore's,
Montefiore intersperses his text with provocative questions. For example, so was the marriage of an ogre and a lamb, Stalin's marriage to Nadia Alueva, a metaphor for Stalin's treatment of Russia itself? Had Stalin returned to the apartment, quarreled with Nadia, hit her, and then shot her? So, had Stalin really suffered a nervous breakdown after Hitler's invasion of the USSR, or was this simply a performance?
The rhetorical method of saying nothing but implying everything would be disqualifying for many historians and probably frowned upon by many journalists. It acts as a playful supposition when, in practice, leading the reader to a conclusion. What else can one gain from a section asking if Stalin killed his wife that offers no answer to the question but a healthy lead-up to the idea than the fact the author wants you to walk away feeling like Stalin totally killed his wife? The review contrasts this work with another biography of Stalin by Robert Service, who was quoted for a blurb for Red Tsar. In doing so, I think it lays out a case that Montefiore has committed some history fouls but ultimately dignifies the work, and that's frustrating. Alexopoulos notes Montefiore believes Stalin might possibly have been a police agent, and that Montefiore has decided against blaming Stalin's behavior on mental illness. In a review by Charters Wynne of Montefiore's next book, Young Stalin, we see those two exact assertions have changed. Stalin is noted by Wynne to be, in Montefiore's view, possibly psychotic. Montefiore dismissed the police agent rumors as unfounded. This review as a whole is more willing to poke at the pop nature of the book while expressing its positive contributions. It includes such choice lines as, "It is Montefiore's research that is of value to scholars," followed by, "One might think, given his penchant for sensationalism, that Montefiore would be unable to resist suggesting that Stalin worked for the Okhrana." Also, as a related aside, I was searching to see if there was somewhere that had a version of Red Tsar with citations, and I stumbled upon a now archived Ask Historians post where someone asked if Stalin really did have, relations with a 13-year-old. The one answer cites Montefiore and then gets into the important question of if he's reliable, and gives a tepid yes, buttressed by this exact JSTOR review to say, "Nonetheless, academic historians such as Charters Wynne have praised the depth and breadth of Montefiore's research." And would you believe that review also addresses the exact question of, did Stalin impregnate a 13-year-old? Saying,
Stalin's sex life gets considerable attention. Montefiore portrays Stalin as an unscrupulous womanizer, with a weakness for teenagers, including a 13-year-old girl, whom Montefiore claims the then 34-year-old Stalin seduced and impregnated, though the evidence here seems especially inconclusive. It often seems Montefiore accepts uncritically what he finds in his sources, especially if they add juicy tidbits to his well-written narrative.
Yeah, so just because someone answers your Ask Historians post with a long answer with footnotes doesn't mean they have any idea what they're talking about, just a bit of advice. Frankly, there's this painful feeling I get when I see reviews of his work that ostensibly say, the book has some problems with the history elements of it, but it's well written. What is, although many readers will appreciate Montefiore's dramatic and entertaining narrative style, it can sometimes be distracting, but an endorsement of this style which eschews proper citation and favors narrative, as though there's mutual exclusivity between accuracy and intrigue. It's like they're coming into assessing a history book as creative fiction. If someone handed me a paper that just casually included leading rhetorical questions and frankly bizarre anecdotes, I'd immediately circle them with a red pen. As much as I chide the work for overemphasizing prose and story, there are moments where it comes together. 3/4 of the book are downright difficult to read due to a learned incredulity. When the book reaches the post-war era, it starts to rely more on interviews and testimonies of living people, the sons and daughters of Politburo members, people who themselves met Stalin, were raised alongside his children, rather than unsourced anecdotes between cited quotes that barely form a conversation. Further, the purge, the famine, the war, it's all past. History is slower, so to speak, so the absence of actual connection to historical events is less painful. The chapter that announces the famine, named for the famine, takes until 6 of its 14 pages to first mention it and barely stays on the subject. Later chapters do touch on it more, but when reading the work, one has no expectation that any thread will be followed, that any chronological order is sustained. When the chronology shifts to late life, when the subject is just Stalin is lonely now, the general haze of events and the personal drama angle work better. The biggest issue, to me, is that a book like this exists as it does, in a space where citation is unimportant. It is baffling that the point of contact between history and mass appeal, what we've called pop history, is allowed to go without citation. To let bold claims, cited claims, anecdotes, and rhetorical questions sit together knowing they will muddle in the reader's mind. In the past, I've made a point of poking at things like Civ for having no sources and making bold claims, and I accept that It's Just a Game does have some merit. But what is this history book if not just a history book? People go on to cite these books in ways they don't cite video games. After enough anecdote, I find myself entirely distrusting the author. After enough sections written like a stage play or a novel, I cannot take on faith most of what is said. After enough Stalin snarled, I lose a sense of what's grounded. And that has to sit alongside the fact Montefiore did crack new archives. In doing so, he becomes part of an academic conversation without a scholar's scrutiny. And part of me wonders if it's some reflexive distancing. He's an outsider writing history, so real historians don't care to meet him where he is, because they know better than to read pop history. But then in making that divide, in not addressing pop history, they're just seeding the popular perception of historical events, letting it be wrong to a vast majority of people. Why? Because they personally will know better? What is the point in doing history work in order to be in a personally correct minority rather than to set the record straight? Montefiore is to many, many, many people outright credible, or credible with some hiccups, or a learned warning to take his stuff with a grain of salt, but that just lets him thrive. I could write a whole essay for a class where I cite just his works, and cite all the parts where he just says stuff like that Stalin gave someone's kid candy every day to Pavlov the kid into responding to him rather than the parrot. And what are you gonna do about it? Tell me I need a better citation? I cited his work. He just didn't cite anything for that segment. Robert Service said the book was good. What's the problem? It's a best-selling book. Sorry, I can't use the primary sources he used because they haven't been published, so this is my next best thing. Oops. Do you see how that's just a mess waiting to happen? One that's probably happened a few dozen times over in one way or another. Maybe I'm under-presuming the difficulty of reading history texts. Maybe I'm ignoring the hurdle it can be for someone who didn't study history, but reading Montefiore, I do not get the sense that he's written his works to clarify difficult parts, to translate from nerd to normie, but to make of history a tale that's his to tell. And in the end, we hit an important question. So what? The intent of pop history is to, on some level, make palatable the efforts of historians. It is similar to the translation that high fashion does down to things that actual normal people wear, or that's a way it's sometimes described. I do not have an issue with taking college concepts and trying to explain them to people, with finding ways to make things more interesting or consumable. If I did, most of my videos would not exist. I am, in some sense, doing pop history. From Montefiore back to the Truisms, there is undoubtedly a spicing up, a drawing in, a creation of appeal to history. So what's my problem? Well, for Montefiore, it's twofold. The fact that he's constantly praised for sources but then doesn't give them to most readers, and indeed hasn't released translations of many as I understand, and that he's just saying things. For others, it's often down to these odd generalizations and adoptions of authority that lead people astray. There's just weird lies and falsehoods that aren't any less complicated than the truth. Montefiore is in this between space of being taken serious by some historians and blown off as having a lesser standard by others. Ergo, it's fine that he's got narrative and drama and says Stalin snarled like he was there, but the problem doesn't end with him. In fact, as I've implied, there are other less serious history books that either merit less critique or indeed go on to even greater heights of shaping public perception, and that's kinda bleak. Books like Sapiens go on to be bestsellers, and the inadequacies are excused as generalist overview. It can't get into everything, as though the book doesn't have biases, weird lenses, and make ridiculous claims that just breed more truism. Is it really so much harder for the average layperson to understand that the French Revolution was motivated by the material factors of the middle and lower class than it is to make a claim that in 1789, the French population switched almost overnight from believing in the myth of the divine right of kings to believing in the myth of the sovereignty of the people? What does flattening the narrative into a "it just happened" do for anyone? That's just giving historians more damage to undo. What does pop history do for us in a world where it's allowed to just perpetuate bad history? What good does laughing at the "it came to me in a dream" 18th century historian or the national spirits 19th century historian and his impact do if we're going to just turn around and trust the "it's just human nature" 20th century pop historian or the 21st century non-historian impossible task of summarizing humanity, of making theories, of everything? We have to be critical of these things. We have to recognize that as democratized as publishing and writing have become, the meta of best-selling has become being attention-grabbing, exciting, dramatic. I don't like how much this reminds me of YouTube, to be honest. And what good is it to have a world where more people than ever are out there reading history books if they're walking away from them with maligned understandings, leaving their one trip into understanding Stalin and going, "Did you know he impregnated a 14-year-old? Did you know he called his friend a fat goblin? Did you know he had his wife killed? That's crazy. Did you know they called vodka Rykovka? Did you know Louis XIV once said, 'L'état c'est moi'?" Okay, well, wow. Turns out that moving and not having a desk for a while really upsets the old YouTube pretentious video workflow. I hope the wait was worth it for the dorks out there. Speaking of dorks, thanks to Sako and Freda for the voice lines. And also, thanks to my patrons who make my inconsistent work consistently? Something like that. This time we have special thanks towards Jan Orsa, Cesare Mikua, Defender, Galactic Beyond, Isaac of Lyria, Lissing Afame, Mark Soto, Michael Kelly, Nick, Nitopir, Noun Sniffer, Queen Naked Morat, Sipperternipsy, and Vichire. I don't know what next time will be, but I'm far from out of ideas. I want to tackle Old World sometime, then of course there's Inscription, and let's just say I have some thoughts about EU4 and the trajectory of EU5 now that that's getting some light shed on it. And in general, maybe things will get back on schedule, so to speak, now. Bye.